Well, hey guys, I got the real show coming right after this. I did this whole show on the night of the Sicilian Vespers and figured out how that was just a story that somebody started. Got down really to the meat of it, who started that story, and that the night that Salvatore Marazano was killed, it didn't kill a whole bunch of 40 or 50 people all over the United States. But then I realized I got all done with it and put it up and thought, okay, I'll get this out in a little bit. And then I realized I didn't say what the real Sicilian Vespers was, because there was a real Sicilian Vespers, a night of and actually several weeks of. So it was a successful rebellion on Sicily, of course, in the island of Sicily. And it broke out on Easter of 1282 against the rule of a French-born king, Charles I of Anjou. And he had ruled Sicily as an island since 1266. It'd be about 20 years at that time. And they say within about 6 weeks, 13,000 French men and women were slain by the rebels. And the government of Charles of Anjou, Charles I of Anjou, lost control of the island. And there was an ongoing war for a while after that. But let me tell you kind of what happened, how it got started. The Sicilian ruling class, they had, strong men in every little hamlet and village, and they had their own ruling class, but they had no share in the government of the Frenchmen. And they were not compensated with lucrative posts abroad as other provincial people from France and Neapolitans were also. And Charles imposed heavy taxes on the Sicilians, because he was creating his own empire and he was outfitting an army, and he saw actually Sicily as a springboard for some of his ambitions throughout the Mediterranean. He wanted to take Constantinople back, and he wanted to take back Constantinople. He wanted to capture territory and countries down in northern Africa for their natural resources. And if you think about it, Sicily gives a great springboard to North Africa and over to the Straits of Dardanelles and Turkey and Constantinople. He was taxing the heck out of them for that, and wanted to use their people for his ambitions. And some people would say that there was unrest in Sicily at the time, and it was stirred by agents from Constantinople. We don't know. Now, the night that this all started, there was the Church of the Holy Spirit in Palermo. I don't know if any of you guys have been to Palermo, and I wonder if it's still there. I didn't go that far. This event takes its name from an insurrection that it was the start of Vespers, the sunset prayer, marking the beginning of the night vigil on Easter, Monday, March 30th, 1282. And according to most stories, there's 3 different stories that all have some similarities. It's, kind of the main thing is some French officer or sergeant or soldier, some French soldier started messing around with a married woman, or several French soldiers started messing around with different women in the crowd around this holy celebration. And one of them was married, and the husband attacked one of the French soldiers and killed him with a knife. Other Frenchmen tried to jump in, and other Sicilians jumped in. They started a big fight, and they killed all the Frenchmen that were there that night because they were far outnumbered by the Sicilians. About that same time, the church bells all over Palermo started to ring for Vespers. And as those things rang and people ran out and said, we got to rise up against the French. And pretty soon the streets are filled with angry armed men crying death to the French. And there's a Sicilian way to say that, but boy, I can't say it. Moranu li Francesi, something along those lines. But every Frenchman they met was killed, and they ran wild that night. The rioters broke into the different Dominican and Franciscan convents and killed all the French brothers, friars, nuns that were out there. And it's kind of interesting how they decided who was French or not is there is a sound that the French tongue can never accurately quite reproduce, and it's Sicily. And if they could not say Sicily, then they decided they were Frenchmen or they were French origins, and they killed them. And anybody that failed that test was slain. And I mean, this first night there was 2,000 French men and women killed in the city in Palermo, and the rebels were in complete control of Palermo. And from then on, it spread all over Sicily. And like I said before, they killed as many as 13,000 people, French soldiers, any French people that had immigrated to Sicily. And so that's kind of the night of the Sicilian Vespers, and the ongoing what happened after this became the War of the Sicilian Vespers for a while, and how they threw off this Charles of Anjou, Charles I of Anjou, and the French king. So on to the story of the mob and the night of the Sicilian Vespers, guys. Well, hey guys, a little bonus episode here I've got. When I first got into reading about the mob, and I'm talking about back in my early 20s, maybe even late teens, I was really fascinated by this story, the night of the Sicilian Vespers. I read a book about, these early days of the mob. I don't remember the book. There's one, Murder Incorporated, which I think that was after that. It was even earlier than that. It may have been Peter Moss's story about Joe Valachi, and might even been before that. Anyhow, I read a book about the founding of the mob and talking about the night of the Sicilian Vespers, how when this was the night after that Luciano had Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and a couple of his guys kill Salvatore Marazano, who had declared that he was the boss of bosses, or the capo dei tutti capi. And if you think about that word, capo must be singular boss, and capi, C-A-P-I, must be bosses. So capo dei tutti capi. Anyhow, they murdered him September the 10th, 1931, and that was what they called the Americanization of the mafia. Now, over the years, I've become curious, and supposedly, if I don't remember how many people they said that night, there've been a variety of different people or books have reported. One book said there was 40 people killed all over the United States. Another book, I think, said 80 or 60. Anyhow, there's a lot of people killed, and all over the United States. St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a big deal. It wasn't that night. It wasn't that day. And there were only 7 people killed there. So if there were 40 to 60 people in the mafia killed, even spread out across the United States, there would have been headlines in every major city in the United States. Little history on this: Lucky Luciano had killed Joe the Boss Masseria for Maranzano. They were like the two old mustache Pete's that were competing to take over and be the boss of bosses. Pretty soon, Maranzano realized Lucky Luciano was a threat. He was a pretty ambitious guy, and he hired this Irish gangster, Vincent Mad Dog Call, to kill Luciano. Well, Tommy Lucchese got word of this, and he alerted Luciano. They were like peers under Maranzano, and so Luciano struck first. Maranzano ordered Luciano and Vito Genovese to come to his office. And it's in if you are in New York City and you want to go see where this happened, it's in what they call the Helmsley Building. That's at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. Luciano didn't show up at that meeting. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and a couple other guys came in acting like they were government agents, and they stabbed Maranzano several times before shooting them. And that was later on, that was what they called the night of Sicilian Vespers. So let's take a look at this story. Now Luciano, after that, could have declared himself as boss of all bosses, but he abolished that title, and he knew that would create trouble. And he just wanted to make him, himself a boss among other bosses. And he created the National Crime Commission out of that, or the National Syndicate, if you will. And that was a governing body for the entire United States for organized crime, which, we got the evidence of that up in Appalachian and other meetings around the country, and other informants have come in and talked about this. But let's go back and examine this night of the Sicilian Vespers. So one of the first places to look, I got this from Alan May, If you really want mob history, go Google Alan May, May, and you'll find a website with a ton of good stories. And he said that he started looking down this path, and he went to the Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. Now, you would think he would set the record straight on this, since he's a guy that ordered the death of Salvatore Marazano to begin with. Looking in that, you'll find that the only thing he says that day is that he has heard that story, and he said all that stuff them writers always printed about what they called the Night of Sicilian Vespers was mostly imagination. That every time somebody writes about that day, the list of guys that supposedly got bumped off was getting bigger and bigger. He talks like a gangster, doesn't he? Last count I read was around 50. But the funny thing is, nobody could ever tell you the names of the guys that got knocked off that night that Marazano got his. I personally don't know the name of one top guy in the Marazano group in New York, Chicago, Detroit, or Cleveland, or anywhere that got rubbed out that night. So, but maybe since he ordered that, he doesn't want to act like he knows anything about it. He did say the only person that got knocked off that night in New York was a guy named Gerardo Scarpato, who was a guy that owned the restaurant that Lucky Luciano used to set up Joe the Boss Masseria sometime in less than a year before. And so that's, maybe Luciano might have ordered that one in order to cut that connection in case that guy would ever think he might want to testify about the murder of Joe the Boss. I don't know. So let's keep looking at where this came from and what happened in other parts of the United States. I have said this myself over the years, not since I started really seriously doing mafia stuff, but back probably when I was in the intelligence unit and when I was a young guy, I wanted to be, the expert, and I'd read all the books that I could at the time on the mafia. And so I'm sure I said that, but, I have to take those words back. I didn't write it anywhere, at least. Alan May went around and started asking people, and he talked to a guy named Burton Turkis, who was a prosecutor who helped prosecute many of the Murder, Inc. members. And he had a 1951 book. And he said the day Maranzano got his, it was the end of the line for the greaser crowd in the Italian society, the finish of the mustache Pete's. And it was a definite wind up to the mafia as an entity and a power in national crime. He didn't know. Lucky Luciano was going to move down below the radar and make it into a national powerhouse. Burton Turkis, the prosecutor, says, for in line with Lucky's edict, which meant to, do away with the old mustache piece, some 30 to 40 leaders of the mafia's older group all over the United States were murdered that day and over the next 48 hours. Well, now, why would a guy like this, he's a prominent prosecutor, why did he make this up? I mean, and he did say that it was over 48 hours. He didn't say it was all one night. Gang Rule in New York that really was the first book to discuss these murders. Is by Craig Thompson and Alan Raymond. And they claimed that this was the day which all the principal, quote, greasers, unquote, were liquidated. They said that the Americanization campaign bumped into an important snag, for there's many O-line leaders and men of importance who were clannish and illiterate and had no sympathy for the ideas of cooperation that the younger and more far-sighted members of the mob were advocating. So they kind of support it. They don't really have any names. And Joe Valachi, he was one of the more important guys, more important informants, as y'all know. Member of the Genovese crime family. He testified before the McClellan committee. Peter Moss, when he wrote Valachi's story, wrote, the murder of Maranzano was part of an intricate, painstakingly executed mass extermination engineered by the dapper, soft-spoken, cold-eyed Charlie Lucky Luciano. On the day Maranzano died, some 40 Cosa Nostra leaders allied with him were slain around the country. Practically all of them were Italian-born old-timers eliminated by the younger generation making its bid for power. Now, I don't think Joe Valachi talked like that. That's Peter Moss talking. I think he's filling in between the lines here. 1969, there was a professor of sociology at the University of California named Donald Cressy. He was a consultant to the President's Commission on Law Enforcement, and he wrote something called The Theft of the Nation, the Structure and Operation of Organized Crime in America. Now, that's a Theft of a Nation. That was a pretty important book at the time. And he claims the Maranzano slaying was not an isolated incident. It was part of the last major battle of a war. The day Maranzano was killed has been long known as Purge Day in Cosa Nostra. On that day and the 2 days immediately following, some 40 Italian Sicilian gang leaders across the country lost their lives in battle. Oh my God, this guy. Most, if not all, of those killed on that infamous day occupied positions we would now characterize as boss, underboss, or lieutenant. Now, here's a big-time government expert claiming the same thing. So let's look into this a little further. Maybe there's something to it. Another book, 1975, that story's still going around. There's a book called Brothers in Blood, The Rise of the Criminal Brotherhoods by David Chandler. He put kind of a bizarre spin on this. Chandler claims there were 60 victims. Here's what he said. Each of the 60 victims must have been kept under surveillance to establish his daily pattern. For each of the 60, a hit team had to be organized and gunmen chosen who wouldn't betray the plan. When Purge Day, get that, Purge Day arrived, the hit teams had to be delivered to their target's area. A communications liaison must have been worked out to relay the go-ahead message from New York that Maranzano had been killed to each of the teams. At least 300 men must have been in on this plot. Yet it went off without a hitch so smoothly, it took more than a year before the first hint of a Brotherhood purge filtered out to the police. One reason the shakeup went off so quietly was that in many cases it took days, even months, before the bodies were discovered. Some of the bodies have never been found. Wow. This Chandler dude even won a Pulitzer Prize in 1962. That was before this, for investigative reporting. I'd say it was investigative fictional reporting. I see why people get mad at the reporters and newspapers and the media for amping things up. I mean, did you hear what that guy said? When Purge Day arrived, they had 300 men had to be on their targets, and nobody noticed throughout the United States. So he puts that off as because their bodies weren't discovered right away. Well, let me tell you something, folks. In each one of these cities, in Kansas City, had you bumped off some old-line Italian mafia leader, the family would have been everywhere. They would have been asking questions. They would have. You just can't keep that on the down low. You just cannot keep that on the down low. I've been around a little bit. I've been to goat roping and a rodeo and a county fair, man. You can't keep that shit down. So if you look in this Alan May article, I found out that he traced down the origin of this tale, the Night of Sicilian Vespers. Alan May just kept reading and kept researching, and he wanted to find the first mention that of this Night of Sicilian Vespers and all these men getting killed around the country. He finds that there was a history professor from the University of Kentucky named Humbert S. Nelly. What a name, Humbert. Anyhow, he had a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Kentucky Research Foundation. He traveled around the country to 14 cities and did what he called an extensive examination of Italian criminal activity. And he wrote a book called The Business of Crime, Italians and Syndicate Crime in the United States. He claims he traced down the origin of the Night of Sicilian Vespers tale. He found a Collier's Magazine article, and a Dixie Davis, who was a lawyer for Dutch Schultz, claimed that he knew about the killings, and he talked to a reporter, and Dixie Davis said there was a Dutch Schultz gunman named Abe Bro Weinberg, and that Weinberg had discussed the killings with him. And he said Weinberg claimed that he was part of the Maranzano murder, which would make sense. He could have been. It was the Origins of Murder Incorporated that did that Maranzano murder under Marlansky and Bugsy Siegel. And he claimed that the killings did happen that night, and there was a nationwide attack on all the old timers. He claims, in fact, at the same hour as Maranzano's death, there were about 90 guineas knocked off all over the country. So that's one of the first origins of this story. And if there were 90, and were there 60, were there 40, how many were there? So who were these supposed murder victims? So he did find that 3 men in New York City in that immediate vicinity were murdered on September the 10th. Samuel Monaco and Louis Russo. They found their bound bodies by the Hackensack River. And there was a James Lepore who had been murdered on a Bronx street. Now, the best he could find, other than Maranzano and this Scarpato, those were the only people killed in New York City. And he didn't find any in the other parts of the United States. So this appears to be the extent of this night of Sicilian Vespers massacre. Now, how did he do this research? Well, mainly he went to newspapers. And believe me, I have done a lot of newspaper research in Kansas City and other cities. And back then, especially in the 30s, these newspaper reporters were all over the mob. They had sources in the mob. They drank in mob bars. They drank with mobsters. They did favors for each other. They were all over. They had good friends in the cops. They had sources in the cops. You had dirty cops who were in bed with the mob back then and they would have known something about it. These people start dropping out of sight, even if you don't find the bodies, like I said before. So he looked at did an extensive review of newspapers in Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Denver, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. So, old line mobs, people, New Orleans, Kansas City, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Boston. Somewhere you're going to find during those months of September, October, November of 1931, there would be people missing, there'd be people murdered, there'd be bodies found, more than one. Found only one murder that could be even remotely tied to that purge, and that was in Denver, Colorado. So why Bo Weinberg started telling that to people, I don't know. He was eventually killed himself by Dutch Schultz, but, I don't know. It's just, it's an interesting story, and I just wanted to relate that to you and start putting that myth to rest, the night of the Sicilian Vespers. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your support. Be sure and like and subscribe. Tell other people about the podcast and the YouTube channel. And, that's how we keep going as we get more and more followers. And I like having more and more followers. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth it to do it. I might just quit. No, I'm just kidding. I do it for fun. I do it because it's enjoyable. And I like the intellectual stimulation, and better than working a crossword puzzle, I say. Don't forget, look out for motorcycles when you're out there on the streets. And if you have a problem or you have a friend that has a problem with PTSD and they've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline. Thanks, guys.